As you take your seats, you can turn back a few pages there from 2 Corinthians to the book of Romans, chapter 15, where we are reading a similar passage where Paul's talking somewhat about the same subject matter, about taking up collection for the poor saints there in Jerusalem. But as you turn there, I have to say what a wonderful delight it is to look over here and see our precious and dear friends, Dr. Al Moeller and Mary Moeller, have joined us this morning, come over from Louisville, and as you know, he is my boss. And I've been told you were coming. I'd have worked harder to prepare a better sermon, but would you welcome them and just show your appreciation? Incredible delight and joy to have them, and certainly our church owes them much in a lot of ways, both obvious and not so obvious. And were it not for me being at Southern, I probably wouldn't be here. And had I not had the kind of support and encouragement there to do all that I have done in these last 20 years, I probably would not have made it either. So I'm so grateful to them and owe them a great debt of gratitude. It's a joy to serve the Lord Jesus together, so thank you for being here. Our text is Romans 15. I want to begin reading in, if I back up, beginning with verse 18, Paul is saying to the Romans, whom he's never visited there, but he wants to come there, but he's giving them his philosophy of missions, and then he's going to give them his travel plans. And beginning in verse 22 today is our passage, but I want to read beginning in verse 18 so we get the flow of what he's saying. Romans 15, verse 18, "For I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and all the way around to Illyricum, I have fulfilled the ministry of the gospel of Christ. And thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. But as it is written, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand. This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you, once I have enjoyed your company for a while. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem, for they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. When therefore I have completed this, and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness of the blessing of Christ." Well, it's appropriate that we get Paul's travel plans. You know, so often we hear in song and sermons and even in our just ordinary thought, we think of life as a journey. We use that kind of vocabulary. We compare life to traveling. We are sojourners, we're pilgrims, we're taking a trip, we're wanderers, we're headed for the promised land, we're going to cross the river, arriving home, finding rest. It's an odyssey, it's a journey, it's a trip. Well, Paul's travel plans there's a lot more to it than you might think, because his travel plans provide a road map to gospel faithfulness. I just want you to see the way he thinks, how he makes his decisions about where he's going and when he's going and why he's not just going where he wants to go and where it feels good, but there's always a strategy. You know, the Christian life has to be lived strategically on mission. That's not just true of Paul, but every follower of Jesus. You know, everything in life is a trade-off. My sons, my grandchildren, they've heard this speech many times. Life's a series of trade-offs. And greater devotion usually requires greater trade-offs. The question isn't, do you want to be a good Christian? I mean, what Christian would say no to that? The question is, what are you willing to give up in order to follow Christ faithfully and effectively? See, the gospel changes life's priorities. How strategically do you devote your life? How purposefully do you invest your resources? Now, Paul has a category here. If you were paying attention, he's got a category for good things he wants to do, but he does not do them because something else is more needful. I fear not many Christians seem to have that category. There are a lot of, if we see something good and we would enjoy it, and we just without thinking just do it. But serving Christ makes you yield your desire to duty. Notice the verb Paul uses in verse 22. I've often been hindered from coming to you. Well, what is it that's hindered him? He's referring to what we just read there in verse 20. His desire to preach the gospel where Christ has not been named. And the fact that he's writing this letter to a church filled with believers, he's going to name many of them in chapter 16. And they've been taught the gospel. They have great teachers. He's able to write to them on the deepest level about the gospel in the book of Romans. They know Christ. They've heard the gospel many times. He wants to take the gospel to a place where people have never heard it. What hindered him, well, was not what he said, for instance, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 18. In that passage, he said, we wanted to come to you, but Satan hindered us. And there's a time Satan does get in your way. Satan might keep you from doing God's will. But God's will hinder you from doing your will. Followers of Christ have to let gospel outcomes drive life's decisions. Now, sometimes when Christians hear this, they go, well, man, that sounds like an unpleasant life. I mean, always having to weigh things out, constantly changing plans because people haven't heard the gospel or so many people need you. Well, I'll confess to you, it's exhausting to be sure, but it's glorious. To live life in the knowledge that God is using you, that Jesus has more people who praise his name because you took the gospel to people, you discipled them, you walked through storms with them. That's the most gratifying thing you'll ever know. This past week, I don't like getting on social media much anymore, but every now and then I go just to look at people's pictures and to find out what was going on. And up in my feed came a post from a friend of ours, a lady named Gloria Stuckey. And here was Gloria's post. I don't think she'd mind me reading it to you. She wrote, yesterday we celebrated our 35th anniversary with a walk in the woods. Marriage is not always a walk in the woods. Sometimes we walk on a mountaintop and sometimes in the valley. Over these 35 years, my continued goal has been to love Steve well and to be loved well. Only my love of Christ comes before my love of my man. Sometimes my love of self gets in the way. I've idolized him in my heart. I've disliked him in my heart. Some of you married folks know exactly what I mean. But when I've walked in a healthy relationship with Christ, I've loved Steve with his Christ-like love. Only through building our love on the foundation of Christ are we able to stand these 35 years and long to walk together for many more. Well, I read that with just incredible joy. And do you know why? Because I remember the day Gloria Stuckey sitting in our living room on Ashland Avenue in Lexington, Kentucky, put her faith and trust in Jesus Christ. I remember when she and Steve moved up to in the street from us, 3 houses up from us, and neither of them knew the Lord. And I remember that we were in such a busy season that it took us months to finally find the time to invite Gloria up to our house and to just share the gospel with her. And I remember how as she left our home that day, she stopped and turned to me and said on her way out the door, after having put her faith in Jesus, said, "I was wondering when you were going to do this." You know, I read her now as a mature believer who she pours her life into many other Christian women and has just a tremendous ministry herself. And what I hear is not just those words, but I remember everything behind it. I remember not only her profession of faith, I remember that I had to put other things aside, other things that a busy pastorate demanded of me, to find time to leave the 99 and go search for the one. But reading that this many years later, can I put a price on that? Can I in any way quantify all that means? You see, duty becomes desire when we follow Jesus. It sounds like drudgery when we say we've got to yield our desire to our duty. But I point out to you that Paul's not doing this against his will. There's no one putting a gun to his head and saying, "You must do this or you'll die." He'd love to come and spend time with the Romans. He'd have great fellowship with them. But the needs have been great where he is. And his duty has become his chief desire. Delayed gratification for a greater joy of obedience. It's really a mark of maturity. Even more than that, it's a mark of true love of Christ. I've got to, one more time, since it's the York Farewell Tour, one more time, let's talk about the Princess Bride. There's just great theology in it because we all remember at the beginning of the movie, the Robin Wright character, she plays Buttercup and lives on this farm on a hillside, and there is a servant boy, Wesley. And even though it's not like she lives in some opulent palace, she acts regally and very snobbish, and she orders the farm boy around with absolute abandon. She makes liberal use of her authority as she tells him what to do, and yet no matter how menial the task, Wesley always responds to her orders the same way. He says, "As you wish." "Farm boy, polish my horse's saddle." "Farm boy," as she drops 2 pails at his feet, "fill these with water." "Farm boy, fetch me that pitcher." And though she is maddeningly condescending, he's the model servant. He never refuses her demands. His attitude is kind and willing. And the grandfather who's reading the story to his grandson, acting as the narrator, reveals that one day Buttercup had a precious insight. That day, he said, she was amazed to discover that when he was saying, what he meant was, "I love you." Well, that's a really good way to serve Jesus, isn't it? That it's not begrudging obedience to Christ. "Oh, I have to stay here where these people don't know anything and they don't have any Christian values whatsoever." Paul was like, yes, God has put me here where Christ has not been named, so that I'm not building on someone else's foundation. I am going to teach them the gospel so that he has their praise too. And when we yield desire to duty, the love of Christ turns our duties into desires. Ministry is often triage. There are people you can't help. Then there are those you can. And then there are those who'll be fine without your help. And you're going to spend your life with one of those three groups. It's usually the people that you can help. They need you specifically to be involved in their lives. You don't do it to gratify self. You do it because of the great need. But when duty becomes your desire, you find opportunities in responsibilities. And Paul here is looking for ways to use the responsibilities God has given him to have great gospel opportunity. He says to them, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. So his goal is never just to come spend time with the Romans. It's like, oh, okay, now remember, at this point, Spain is the end of the world. It's the edge of the world. There's nothing beyond the Atlantic coast in Paul's mind. He's never been there. He's only heard of it. He knows that that's the extreme reach of the Roman Empire. And man, he wants to go there because he knows nobody there knows Jesus. And so I'm hoping to stop by and see you in Rome on my way to Spain. In verse 25, I'm going to Jerusalem bringing aid to the saints first, and then I'm going to come see you. Now look at this. Notice what he's doing. He was on his way to Spain. That's where he ultimately wants to go. But they need his help. They need the gospel. But first, he knows that in Jerusalem, there's a great famine. I think the famine lasted something like 18 years. And the saints in Jerusalem were starving to death. And Paul's attitude was, we can't let our brothers and sisters die of starvation. And you owe them a debt. So let's take up a collection, an offering to take to the poor saints so that they can know that we care, so they can have food. And so notice how he's got all these moving parts. Oh, I want to go to Spain. First, I got to go back to Jerusalem. And Paul's concern for the impoverished saints in Jerusalem really has been obvious. He mentions that effort in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. He talks about taking up a collection for them. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, Pastor Chris just read us from 2 Corinthians 8. That's what chapters 8 and 9 in 2 Corinthians is about. It's taking up that offering for them. So here's Paul's attitude. Man, here's a need. I can meet this need. I can rouse others to help meet that need. I can use this common effort to galvanize our churches, because there's this divide. It's really been at the heart of the book of Romans that the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers have had a little bit of friction. And that's not just in the church at Rome, it's sort of everywhere. And he says, this is a way we can show unity. We can meet this need. And the offering was evidence that the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers saw themselves as one people of God. And that's been a major theme in the book, hasn't it? I mean, we've seen the great exchange as the theme of the book. And he follows through with that right now. We're exchanging our individual identities for the identity of the one people of God. And this is Gentiles helping Jews, just as Jews had given the Gentiles their scriptures and their Messiah. Another way to see this is that you leverage community for unity. Notice in verse 26, Paul says, now, he just calls them Macedonia and Achaia, but he's talking about the churches, the believers there in these two regions. Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution. Twice, in fact, he points that out. Again in verse 27, they were pleased to do it. We heard that in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, that it gave them joy to do this. Now, you remember from our study of Romans all the way back in chapter 12 and verse 2, when we're talking about the will of God, we talked about the four affections, that every mind is motivated by four affections: delight, desire, sorrow, and fear. And the will of God will order those four affections. Here you see Paul is showing the affection they have to do the will of God. That what they fear is being out of the will of God. Their delight, their desire is to be of service and of help. Now he's telling these Romans, there's not a small implication here that he wants them to feel the same desire. You need to get on this board. You need to help those poor saints in Jerusalem as well. And all these churches working together for the common goal provided a kinship. Do you know the word koinonia, the Greek word for fellowship? Well, he uses the verb form of it in verse 27. It's translated, I think, in the ESV, share in their blessings. But it's that word, to fellowship in, to have a part in, to share together in these blessings. He said, just as you share in their spiritual blessings, you need to share in their physical needs. You owe a spiritual debt. And so you must turn spiritual debts into material blessings. That's what he says in verse 27. Why? If the Gentiles have shared in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. That's the verb diakoneo. It's where we get our word deacon. They ought to serve in these material needs as well, Paul's implying. We are debtors. Paul's used that word before in Romans, hasn't he? Remember, all the way back in chapter 1. In verse 14, he said, we're debtors both to the Greeks and to the barbarians to take the gospel to them. But he says here, we're also debtor to those who already know Jesus, who have gone before us, the ones whom God used to bring the gospel to us. And Paul uses this occasion to further unify the Jewish and Gentile believers, reminding them of this gospel debt and their gospel opportunity to bless those who blessed them. Well, that's something to keep in mind, isn't it? We owe a debt to those who've never heard to take the gospel to them. But we owe a debt to those who brought the gospel to us to make sure that God is caring for them. So he plans to come see them. But it's not simply about enjoying the company of the Romans. Paul is teaching us how to advance fellowship to partnership. He says, I'm going to come see you to be helped on my journey there by you. Did you notice that? It's just such a quick statement, but Paul makes it clear we're going to take up a love offering. I'm coming on my way to Spain. Spain is at the far edge of the empire. I'm going to need your help. I can't do this alone. I need you to make an investment. I need you to be a partner with me in this endeavor. He says in verse 28, I will leave for Spain by way of you. Oh, do you get that? You're going to help me go to Spain. He needs their help. But more importantly, they need to help him. They need to be a partner in this great gospel endeavor as he goes. They need to feel that level of commitment and duty that flips the desire and makes it delightful. The Christian life has always lived with this sense of desire and duty, longing for something beyond, but difficulty in leaving behind the things left undone. And I think about when I read this travelogue. By the way, it should not be lost on us that in 11 of Paul's 13 epistles, he has a section on his travel plans. Isn't that remarkable? He's always thinking about what comes next, where he's going to go, how he's going to leverage who he is for the gospel's sake. And here in just these few verses, he's got one view of the region where he is. Notice, he says, I want to go where the Christ has not been named. And he says here that, okay, my place here is over. Apparently, this has been evangelized sufficiently. I'm ready to move on to the next place. So he's got one view of where he is, another view of where he's going, Spain, still another view of where he once was but needs to go back, Jerusalem. He needs to take care of those saints. And he stirs us all to see these great needs all around us, wherever God has marked our steps and taken our lives. Evangelism, fellowship, service, appreciating the saints, dispelling the darkness. And those are the criteria by which we discern God's will and live our lives. Because back of all Paul's instructive travel plan is a commitment to sacrifice good things for the best thing. Well, that's the stewardship required in every believer. We don't get to do merely good things. The question is always, what's the best thing? What's the best stewardship of my life, of my resources, of my time? You can do a lot of good things, but what's the travel plan God has for you? Finding not merely what you can do, but what you're compelled to do for the glory of God. Well, there's just nothing like getting up in the morning with a sense of divine purpose. God saved me for a reason. And I'm a missionary on my job, in my neighborhood. I'm looking for people moving in the houses around me. I'm making contact with people. I'm making sure they know the gospel. This is the very purpose of my life. Not merely what I can do, what I'm compelled to do. Not content with merely making a dent, but with making a difference. Sacrificing the joys and privileges to which I may be entitled for the people and frontiers to which I am called. Not just about what you can do. What's God calling you to do? My friend Al Moeller is here this morning, and I cannot help with him sitting here. I cannot help but help of a thing. So I joined the faculty at Southern Seminary in 1997. And Dr. Moeller and I were both young then. Our hair was a different color then. We were a few pounds lighter then. But Dr. Moeller had been on the Time magazine, had come out with a list of the most, I'm trying to remember, but it was basically the most impactful people, 40 people under 40. And Dr. Moeller made that list. Time magazine said, this guy, up and comer, going to make huge difference in the world. And there were a lot of things happening at that time. National positions coming open. I had picked up our family and moved to Louisville from Lexington. It was like leaving the promised land and going to Egypt. But, and I thought to myself, he might take one of these other positions. And then what? And a particular position came open one day. And I said, let me ask you, do you have any leaning that maybe like if you got offered that position or one like it, would you take that? And I'll never forget what you said. He looked at me and said, that's definitely an intriguing thing, but he said, what you and I do at 2825 Lexington Road will have more kingdom impact than anything else we can do with our lives. And he's got 30 years in there, and I've got almost 27. I took him at his word, and he's exactly right. Man, it's one thing to be a great pastor and a great church. It's another thing to raise up a generation of great pastors and see churches transformed by the gospel. When Tanya and I moved to Louisville, in 1997. There was a very limited number of churches you could go to that were faithfully preaching the gospel. And today, there are just scores. And it's been the influence of the faithful teaching at Southern Seminary. Man, that is exactly what Paul's talking about. There are a lot of good things you can do. The question is, what's the best thing? Paul says to them, I'm confident that when I do come to you, I'm going to come in the fullness of the blessing of Christ. He wanted it all for Christ. From Asia to Europe, to the capital of the empire, to the farthest point of the world as he knew it. And who better to do it than this guy, Paul, formerly known as Saul of Tarsus, Christianity's greatest critic, become its greatest missionary. The zeal with which he once persecuted the church, now surpassed by a passion to proclaim its Redeemer where no one has ever heard the good news. Now, frankly, we don't know if Paul ever made it to Spain. There's no historical record that he did. Here's what we know. He made it to Rome in chains. And we know from history how Paul left Rome in martyrdom. And a cynic may look at Paul's life and say, boy, he got that wrong. What a waste. The great thinker of Christianity, separated from his head. But Paul got nothing wrong. See, circumstances cannot change what is true, only what is felt. Don't let what you feel rob you of what you know. And I want Buck Run to be always a church that is about what we know, what God has revealed, what God has said, what God has shown. We don't come here on a Sunday morning, how do you feel? You know, man, I've preached quite a few funerals in the last several weeks. I've lost dear friends. If all this depends on how we feel, we're sunk. But I serve a risen Savior. He's in the world today. I can remember when Seth was a little boy and we lived in Lexington, the first time I took him with me to get the car washed, to drive through one of those automated car washes. And he was there in the back seat in his little car seat. And I drove into that car wash and, suddenly it's just coat your car. The suds come up, everything gets dark. It's noisy. The jets are spraying water. The car is shaking a little bit as it's taking you through this thing, and the brushes are hitting it, and it's jostling the car. And I turned around and looked at Seth, and his eyes were big and frightened, and he was looking around, and he didn't know what this was. And suddenly he looked over at me, and I'm smiling. I thought it was funny to see him feeling a little moment of fear there, and he saw me smiling. Suddenly a big smile came across his face, and he would look back out at the window, and he'd see a little fear creep in, and he'd look back at me, and I'm smiling, and the smile would come back. And you saw him. Window, Dad. Window, Dad. Till finally we got through it. Suddenly the blow dryer has dried our car, and we're out in daylight again, and we've got a clean car. And I said, look, that wasn't so bad, was it? No. He was never afraid again. It only took the one time. I imagine death's going to be a whole lot like that. Look at the darkness of it. I look at the pain, the loss of faculties, whatever it might be like in your case or mine. It's fearful. But then we look at Jesus. Because I know when Paul faced a Roman execution, he was not wrong in what he had preached. You see, we must not let what we feel rob us of what we know. When Paul faced death in Rome, he did not die alone. A Savior who had been through death before him met him there and passed through that dark night with him. You see, when Christ becomes your deepest desire, your greatest joy, your most profound passion, your eyes fixed on him, it shifts your priorities. It makes life about what you know, not what you feel. If you have never put your faith and trust in Christ, I would not have you miss out on that joy and that knowledge for anything. And today I preach to you the very same message that Paul wanted to preach in Spain and that he took with him everywhere he went, that Jesus is Lord, and that if you will repent of your sins and put your faith in him, calling upon him for salvation, he will not deny you. He will save you. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Paul wrote those words. And he was willing to take that message anywhere, even to the point of death. I preach it today. If you would just call upon the name of the Lord, you can be saved. And if you're a believer, nothing in your life should be a greater object of your desire than serving the one who gave his life for you. So that, like Paul, you say, I don't know what all is going to happen, but I know when I come to you, I'm going to come in the fullness of the blessing of Christ. Because the fullness of Christ's blessing is found in the truth of Christ's gospel.